especially at that time. This is like 19. Do you remember the date of this? 1913. I think the new Descending the Staircase. 1911. So it's 1911. His ready-mades are definitely later in the 19 teens, like 1917 and 1916. One of his most famous, which I'm sure you've seen, that's also in the collection here at the museum, is the fountain, which is the urinal, tipped over 90 degrees and displayed on a pedestal. How many of you? I can see you. How many of you have seen this before or know about this artwork? So there's quite a few that don't, which is pretty good, I think, because that means I'm, I guess, introducing something new to you, which is good. But this was a ready-made object, meaning that Duchamp really just took it from a store, and he presented it to this exhibit of the Independence in 1917. And there's a really complicated story as to the history of this piece and how it's become, the infamous piece that it is today, which is definitely worth researching and looking into. But on the quick, Duchamp was on the jury, the people that decided that what would be in this exhibit of the Independence, and he pretended to be another artist, this artist Armut, and submit this artwork into that exhibition. So he was on the jury. Supposedly with the exhibition, they were supposed to accept all art. Everybody's art was going to be accepted to this exhibition. So to frustrate things and to be a little bit of a jerk, he submitted this urinal as art to see how everybody would respond. And of course the jury couldn't accept it. They said, we can't show this, it's not art. Meanwhile, he says, oh, it's been submitted and the artist is calling it art. And supposedly it was hidden and never exhibited, but a couple years later, there was Alfred Stieglitz, who was a big photographer at the time. He heard of this and he took a picture of it and wrote, and there was this article about how the jurors at the time lied and they really weren't having this independent exhibition where everything was accepted. And he took a picture of the urinal in front of an abstract painting and tried to make a big deal about it. And really from this article in this magazine called The Blind Man, it became the famous fountain that it is today. That he got someone like Alfred Stieglitz, who was a famous photographer, to almost validate its existence years after that exhibit went down. What's great about this artwork is even when you go to the museum today, you'll have people, you can overhear people in the galleries saying, this isn't art, that's art. No, it isn't, it is art. There's this big conversation that still happens today looking at this artwork, that whether it's art or not. I think what Duchamp was really moving toward, maybe, you never really know with him, is that that conversation is what's important. That you insert this object, you insert this idea into art, into the idea of art, into the art establishment, and it builds a dialogue and a conversation about the artwork. I pulled out 3 of Solowitz's sentences that I think relates to this. One would be number 17, which is, all ideas are art if they are concerned with art and fall within the conventions of art. The conventions of art are altered by works of art, and successful art changes our understanding of the conventions by altering our perceptions. So I think, like looking at Solowitz and looking at Marcel Duchamp, you can really start to get how these ready-mades, how these objects just being inserted into the history of art really started to change ideas of what is art or what art could be. They're very much accepted nowadays to take ready-made objects and put them together to make art and things like that. It's something that's much more widely accepted. Some other of his ready-mades are the bicycle wheel, which I'm sure, this is a popular image that I think many of you have seen. Here he's taking 2 ready-made found objects and putting them together to say something else. It's not as simple as the urinal just being pushed over on the side. You also have the artwork that we worked from, which is Bottle Rack, which, again, in its own right, I think it's a beautiful sculpture, but Duchamp's art is taking it out of the design context, the context that said this is to be a useful object to hold bottles, and he puts it on a pedestal and say this is a sculpture, this is an an artwork, and my choice to put it up as artwork is what makes it art, not the person who designed its choice to have it be a bottle wrap. Which is open to debate. Some of you might totally agree with that. Some of you might say that's completely ridiculous. And I think that's what Duchamp is actually going for, not to have it be art and him win that it's art and it's on the pedestal, but to create this conversation around the works.
I think, Ben, also, before you go to the next one, I think the bottle wrap, something else sort of comes into play there, and looking at it here today, it seems like, I mean, I don't recall seeing bottle racks like that anymore. So the notion of time and place comes into, because we see stools, we have stools like that around the room behind me, we have bicycle wheels and spokes. I mean, that's still very common, you know, the urinal and all that other stuff. But when you look at that bottle rack, the first time I pulled it out and showed the students, some people were like, well, what's that? You know, so there was, it's sort of like an alien object that at one time was an everyday object. So I think time comes into there too.
Yeah, I think so too. Do any of you have any responses to that as an object, or did you look into Marcel Duchamp at all in the last 2 weeks, or have your own understanding of Marcel Duchamp to add to the conversation?
Well, what about the designers of the actual objects? Like, it's just kind of interesting how he calls the objects art, and like he kind of claims them as his own. But like, did he consider any of the actual builders of the objects, or no?
So maybe the designer of the bottle rack, you mean, or the designer of the urinal?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
Mm-hmm.
I think he considers them, but for his purpose is the intent, and his intent is to have that same object function in a different way than the designer meant it to function. So I don't think he's definitely not being nice in the sense that he's not giving the designer credit for their product, but he's definitely using that urinal for something other than going to the bathroom in. He's using it within a museum context for a totally different purpose than the initial designer's purpose for that object. So it's almost, you could say that there's an artist, the art company makes a tube of paint. The artist comes and does something else with that paint. He's really doing the same thing, but on a conceptual and idea level. It's no longer just the material, it's transformed into something else via the context, the environment, and all that stuff.
Well, Matt,
that's a good question.
Matt and I, maybe a couple other students about a week or two ago, were having that discussion when we started talking about the notion of collaboration. And he I don't know, maybe you would like to, if you can recall what the gist of your point was, that sort of everybody collaborates?
Like, I mean, like, how I was interpreting things is kind of like every single thing that you could think of in the entire world is a collaboration. I mean, a designer makes something and then a consumer buys it, so that's a collaboration right there between designer and consumer, because the consumer is putting what the designer used to use, and the designer is like getting satisfaction from having what they designed be useful. It's the same thing with art. Like, say you make a painting or whatever, and it goes into a gallery. It's still your painting, but you're collaborating with the gallery to kind of show people what the painting is. And I mean, collaboration is all around us. I mean, literally everything that you could think of in some way ends in collaboration.
Yeah.
And the supplies, he was mentioning that day about, you know, the supplies, the people who wove the company that wove the canvas, the people that made the paint. And I was telling him that was a question early on with computer art. As you know, there were some folks that said, well, a person can't be really a computer artist because they're using Adobe Photoshop. You know, and so Photoshop has a claim to the authorship of this object, which, you know, when we were talking about it, which seems kind of funny to us now, because if that's the case, then if you're drawing a picture, Ticonderoga owns, the people who made the pencil own part of your drawing as well, you know, so just an interesting topic.
And I think that's always a question as artists we have to wrestle with our materials. How much does the material take over your content, or how much is it that the content is driving your materials and you're using your materials as tools and no longer just showing the material for what it is. Like Photoshop filters are probably the greatest example of, if you just take a photograph and push the pastel filter, it's definitely using Photoshop and it's definitely their filter. I don't know how much you're doing anything to it, but it's an easy way to make